come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is Siddhartha Vaidyanathan. You can follow me at SidV on Twitter. And today I'm thrilled to be hosting a special episode where we're talking about a specific book. We like doing book-specific episodes here at 81 All Out. And I'm really delighted to be joined by two writers whose work I've thoroughly enjoyed down the years. So let me first introduce them. First, let me welcome Russell Jackson, who's a writer and analyst for ABC Sport. I was introduced to Rusty, as he's called, via a blog he used to run called The Wasted Afternoons. Marvelous blog. I mean, it is just as all cricket blogs should be. And I've since taken great pleasure in reading his pieces for The Guardian, The Cricket Monthly, and everywhere else that he has written. So welcome, Rusty. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Sid.
Fantastic. And also joining us is another fine journalist from Australia, a former colleague of mine. We used to work together at Cricinfo, and now he is the chief cricket writer at the Melbourne Age. I'm glad to welcome Daniel Brettig. Hi, Dan.
Great to be here, Sid. And, there will be a part of both of us that will forever be waiting outside the Federal Court building in Adelaide in January 2008.
Absolutely, yes. Justice Hanson, wasn't it? That was his name. And yes, Dan and I were part of this group of media people who were waiting outside there to find out what exactly Harbhajan Singh said to Andrew Simons. Of course, nobody found out at the end, and we just moved on with life. So,
actually, just as a side note to that, Russ, what were you doing in 2008 or January 2008?
I think I was probably writing about spanner sets for the Hardware Journal and other illustrious publications like that. I was still working, doing ad copy and very unglamorous writing that nevertheless did prepare me for I suppose filing things on deadlines and making things that aren't interesting sound interesting is what I would say about that period of my career.
Trust me, on that 2008 tour, most of us were not writing on cricket. We were writing on law. We were writing on everything else apart from cricket for a long period of time. So,
exactly right.
Yes, so I will link several of the pieces that Dan and Rusty have written. Dan has also written some lovely books, which you should read. So I will link that as well. Rusty, sorry if I'm forgetting. Have you written a book?
I've published quite a few. I haven't written a full-length book yet.
Oh, yes. Okay.
In the works at the moment. But no, I've published a lot of them, but not written them.
Okay, so yes, you've worked as a publisher, and hopefully we will soon be able to read what you are writing or what you will write. So, as I said, this is a book-specific episode, and we are going to talk about a really, really, one of my favorite cricket books. Favorite also because it was one of the early cricket books that I read, and I was so taken in by the writing and the kind of style that it came with. This book is Mike Coward's book, Cricket Beyond the Bazaar. It was published in early 1990, and it's very hard to categorize the book. It's a mixture of history, travelogue, journalism, sort of ruminations. It's just so much in the book. It's divided into the chapters. Some chapters are match reports. There's some chapters are, just travelogue or tour diary-ish kind of pieces. Also takes in a lot of history. Suddenly he'll be talking about a game played in 1986, and then he will veer off into this wonderful tangent of a series from the 1950s where something happened. So, yeah, it's a marvelous book, and I thought that I should get these two gentlemen to talk about it. So, yeah, I mean, let's sort of begin with when you encountered this book, what you thought of it, your first impressions, Anything. Rusty, you want to go?
Yeah, so I think I got it at a thrift shop many, many years ago, probably in the late 1990s. I know it came out in 1990. I was only sort of 6 years old when this book came out, but it was a period when I was becoming really interested in cricket in the early 90s. So India toured Australia in 1991, 92, and that was one of the formative test summers that I really got into cricket. So when I did see Mike's book, I knew of Mike's work, through my teen years, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. This isn't like the run-of-the-mill player autobiographies that I was used to, or, I think by that point I was starting to read some of Gideon's books. But Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, I thought, oh, this is something a bit unusual. And in many ways, as you said, it is an unusual book, both in its subject matter, but also in its format. I think if I was to put my publisher hat on from when I was publishing books, it's probably the sort of thing I would tell someone not to publish in a commercial sense. As an editor's kind of thing to take on too, it's sort of a bit of a, I say this in a loving way, it's a bit of a mess of a book. It doesn't really make sense, and yet I just loved it from the minute I picked it up. And it's an interesting book for so many reasons, including that the forewords, there's a foreword by Imran Khan and there's a foreword by Gavaskar, and they're short pieces, but they're both very revealing in the way they talk about the interplay between Australian cricket culture and the cricket culture of their own nations. And, Imran talks about how it was that tour in the early 70s that Pakistan kind of got a bit of mongrel into them from being sledged from pillar to post by the Aussies. And Gavaskar, in a similar vein, I think they both talk about how Australians are inflexible in their attitudes to the way they play cricket, and how that just hasn't traditionally worked on those tours of the subcontinent, that the mindset that Australian players adopted through so many of these tours, at times it was disrespectful, at times it was just insular. But it was a very, from the minute you open this book and read those forewords, you think, wow, this is doing something slightly different to what cricket books normally do, particularly Australian cricket books.
Yeah, it was absolutely a similar case for me in terms of expanding my world as would have been as a teenager, what a cricket book could be. I'm pretty sure the first time I ever saw it, or the first time I ever read it, was borrowing it from the Tea Tree Gully Library in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, where Dad would habitually take me on a Saturday morning. I remember it was open from 9 a.m. till 12:30 on a Saturday, and if we weren't there by 10 o'clock, we were running late, because I wanted to have at least a couple of hours there each Saturday morning. So that's when I wasn't playing cricket, of course. But yeah, the fact that it was so hard to categorise upon first contact with it, I think there were times when on first reading of it, it probably frustrated me as a kid, because it was like, well, I really enjoyed, X chapter about the Tide Test or Y chapter about the World Cup. Why isn't there another one of those about 79 tour, or why isn't there another one of those about 82 in Pakistan? That kind of thing. But upon repeat readings, and also upon getting to know Mike's wider body of work more, and I suppose maturing a bit more as a person, you come to really enjoy the kind of the combination of the fact that it's a bit of a hodgepodge in terms of jumping around, but you've got Mike's completely authoritative and very distinctive voice running through.
Absolutely. I think also the context is important here, because the first 4 tours of that Australia, the first 4 official tours, I must mention, because there were some unofficial visits as well. But Australia's visits in the 50s and the 60s, Mike himself writes as the rat and riot years. Basically, they were notorious for either Australian players falling seriously sick, some on the verge of, even calamitous sort of sickness, or there were so many riots, especially in the 69-70 tour, but even before that, there was quite a few disturbances that it was a visit to the subcontinent, and especially India, was considered a hardship posting, and for Australians. But this from 79 to 89-90 is when the Australia-India relationship really blossomed, and things just took such a turn that Australia started, not just India, even Pakistan. Australia toured the subcontinent almost every year apart from 1985. And as Mike writes, even in 85, they could have had Sri Lanka, had the war in Sri Lanka hadn't been at its peak as it was back then. So I want to understand, growing up in Australia, how much of a part did the subcontinent play in the imagination? I mean, I'm assuming it was largely invisible for somebody there, but maybe I'm wrong. So try and explain to me what the context was about that.
Well, an interesting thing about that period, when we're talking about the early 90s, is really, and I'm speaking for myself here, I guess, my knowledge of Indian cricket came from that 91-92 tour, which was sort of Sachin's coming out. And then we had the 92 World Cup, so India was here for that as well. And really, there were gaps to be filled thereafter, because overseas tours weren't shown in Australia until sort of 96, 97. We started to get pay TV. Fortunately, my parents got Foxtel here as soon as it came out, and all of a sudden we were getting this cricket that seemed so exotic to us, because we were not only used to only seeing games played in Australia, we were used to them being presented a certain way by the Nine Network. And an interesting point that Mike makes in his book, and it struck me at the time when I first read it, was a lot of the perception of Australians of this sort of torture and this ordeal of playing in India, that was a byproduct of that Australian summer schedule. So Australia, they were committed to playing from November to March in Australia. That was really the peak period where they could have played in India in much more comfortable conditions. But the Channel 9 ACB deal didn't allow that. So they were always playing later in the year in these, horrendously humid conditions. And that really comes through in Mike's chapter about the Tide Test in 1986, is just how uncomfortable it is, but how, the dimension of that story that I didn't get at the time was that really that was as much Australia's fault as anything that they were there when they were there. So as far as where India loomed in the imagination of Australian cricket fans through that period before pay TV, it was a bit of you were imagining it really, because we saw little snippets on the news sometimes, but you'd really have to wait, if you weren't reading the newspapers, you'd have to wait a month or two for the cricket magazines to be filled in on what was actually happening on these tours.
Yeah, the first cricket tour that I was conscious of in any way was getting packed off to bed as a 6-year-old during the 1989 Ashes tour. That like the cricket's on, it's time for you to go to bed, Dad wants to watch the cricket. And, ironically enough, even though Cricket Beyond the Bazaar covers a period where Australia did go to India and Pakistan a lot, they don't then go they don't go again to Pakistan really, certainly for a test tour, until 1994. And they don't go back to India until the 1996 World Cup. And so the 96 World Cup, which was shown in combination, I think, on Nine and on would have been Premier Sports or whatever Foxtel's predecessor was. That was my first chance to actually watch cricket live from India, live from Pakistan. And, that was also the continuation of a running theme that summer because, of course, Sri Lanka had been in Australia. It had been a very fractious home summer involving Sri Lanka, and probably one that if Mike was ever to update Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, he'd have to have one about the 95-96 season, I would have thought. And I just have a distinct memory that Channel 9 broadcast the opening ceremony, which you might recall at Eden Gardens, that had a sort of a fairly average-looking laser light show. But I just remember Tony Gregg was commentating, and the first words you heard on the broadcast was him intoning very almost religiously, "Welcome to India." And it's really from there, because obviously Australia go back later in '96, that the whole thing becomes much more familiar, but still so fascinating and still so foreign, particularly in terms of the type of cricket that was played as against what Russ and I both watched on Channel 9 year after year.
And the only other thing I would say about that with the TV broadcasts is that my brothers and I would tape games. We'd record them on the VCR. And so the 91-92 Indian summer in Australia, that sort of carried on for about 3 years for us, because we would watch these videos over and over again. This is before YouTube. Sometimes they'd play some of those games during rain delays in subsequent summers. But there was also this, a summer of cricket had a much longer lifespan, I feel. There were tour books. At the end of the summer, you'd get the Channel 9 kind of compendium of the summer. So that, it's probably, this is purely about my age, but that 91-92 summer, that sort of dragged on forever for me. And then, as Dan said, we had the World Cup in '96, and from there on, Australia and India probably start playing against each other a little bit more. But there was a big lag there where there wasn't a lot of cricket between. It sort of felt like we played Pakistan much more than we played India.
Yeah, well, it's something I'm sorry, Sid. It's something that I'm sure we'll get into in terms of the chapter about Pakistan '88 in particular. But I think, and we can probably unpack this a bit later, but there's a certain linkage between that tour and then the fact that Australia and India and Pakistan aren't playing a whole lot in the following years because of what happens at the board level.
Yeah, it's almost as if Mike saw something that many people didn't, because the period between 79 and 89 is so interesting, because before that, India and Australia don't play as much as they could have for so many years. India got test status in 32, and between 32 and 79, they basically play 4 test series in India. And then, of course, India go to Australia. That's again, not that many at all. And then between 79 and 89, you have this whole Australia coming to India almost every year. And then after 89, the next full series is in 98 when Australia go back to India. The 96 was just a one-off test. So it's a really interesting period for India-Australia relations. I started watching cricket around 86, 87. The 87 World Cup is one of my early memories. And the people around me, like people slightly older than me, people around me, they were like so into that particular Australian team, which wasn't that good compared to earlier or later Australian teams. But still, there were the players there were so many players who are probably not that big in Australia who are quite big in India. I mean, Dean Jones being, of course, the classic example, the late Dean Jones. But Allan Border is revered in many parts of India, and I'm pretty sure he's not even revered in many parts of Queensland the way he is in parts of India. There is, and all these, so many other cricketers. I mean, and Simon O'Donnell, a young Steve Waugh, who Indians saw a lot of, Tony Dodemaide, Bruce Reid. I mean, these are players who were like part of conversation when I was growing up. Yeah. And it was really interesting, the kind of Australian teams that we saw so much of.
Well, the Allan Border part of that, Sid, is very interesting. That, we've always sort of known that Border and Steve Waugh are revered figures in India. And a little bit of that obviously is just to do with how many tours they went on. But it's also in Allan Border's case, I mean, he was a phenomenal away batsman. His test average was 56. and he averaged the same at home as he did away, which is unusual for an Australian batsman, full stop. But it was particularly unusual in that era. And you say that about AB being revered in India maybe more than, particularly now in Australia, I think. And what I spoke about earlier is part of that. We didn't see a lot of AB's cricket overseas. The 84 tour of West Indies, when he was phenomenal, these Indian tours where he's making these hundreds that are just, they don't exist to Australians, those innings. So that's, that's part of the mystery of in this book, these tours that Mike is writing about. They're just things we missed. And legends were kind of made out of that clearly in India that we maybe don't understand in Australia.
Yeah, let me just put one stat in there. Allan Border came with every Australian team to the subcontinent during his career. He played 19 tests and averaged 57.63. That's serious stuff. To average anything more than 50 in India for an overseas batsman is amazing. 57? Oh, wow. And he was so good against spin. I mean, people talk about, he was great against pace and spin, but against spin in India to play like that, with a team which was largely just about coming up, or in fact, if you go back to the 79 team, which was still, had so many, he was a younger player among the older players. So yeah, he played in teams that went from mediocre to average to okay to getting better. And still, look at his record.
Yeah, neither of the teams on those tours that Border was in India with were, could in any way be classified as strong Australian teams. The 86 one in large part became a strong team later, but they were nowhere near that at that point. And so, I think in addition to Border's own runs, I think you need to appreciate his ability to build partnerships with players who were either lacking in know-how for the conditions, but also just lacking in self-confidence. Obviously, the one that we know most famously is Dean Jones in Madras/Chennai, where it's literally his first innings as number 3 for Australia. So,
and it's his first Test century too.
Yeah. So the fact that he was able to not only make runs, but also, I think I'm right in saying that out of those 9 Test matches, Australia only lose one of them. That's an incredible performance, certainly relative to how a number of Test matches were spirited away from Australia against India in subsequent years when it was much better credentialed teams and much more seasoned ones in terms of knowing what to expect.
Yeah. Also, with regard to the previous question, I'd like to understand a bit more about the beyond cricket as well. One of the reviews for this book, not that which didn't come out at that time, but which came out like much later, was this veteran Indian cricket writer Suresh Menon, who said that Coward's writings probably played a role in demystifying the subcontinent to Australians and Australian cricketers. So just reading this kind of book, and can you talk a bit about like your impressions of the subcontinent, not just in cricket, but just also because I also ask because, these days immigration is increased a lot to Australia. So you would see and interact with more people who have moved from the subcontinent or who have parents who moved from the subcontinent. But back then, I'm imagining the numbers were very few. So give me an idea of that and what was it in your mental space? Or was it largely cricket?
It was a little bit cricket back then. My wife, her family are Sri Lankan, so I'm probably an example of that where there has been, of that migration pattern. I guess our family is an example of that. But in that time that I was talking about in the early 90s, it was a pretty white area that I grew up in on the Mornington Peninsula, but there was one Indian boy in my class at school. And he was into cricket, and so was I. So we were immediately hit it off, and we were friends. And He'd be Tendulkar when he batted, and I'd be Craig McDermott or whatever. So that to me was quite normal in a very small class of boys. One of my friends was Indian, and we talked about cricket. So I had a very early link to that. But as far as, and it's almost too much of a cliche, but his parents ran the local Indian restaurant even. So we were eating the food and, as much as you can be in the outer suburbs, had some experience of elements of Indian culture. But I'd say otherwise, one great thing about, being into cricket when you're a kid, particularly in this era, was it was almost like a geography lesson as well. To be interested in cricket, broaden your horizons about, all these places that Australia would play cricket and the countries who'd tour. So, yeah, as far as an Australian, what's rare about Mike and what's rare about this book is that Mike obviously has a great affinity with India particularly, and that his open-mindedness and his sort of relish for explaining the culture in his writing was totally unique in that era. The Australian cricket press of the time was probably quite parochial, and they tended to fall in line with the players and the team management as far as some of the negative stereotypes about touring India, whereas Mike's work is marked by, a total opposite of that. It's an open-mindedness and a wish to explain this place to people. So, yeah, I'd say I wasn't totally unaware of Indian culture, but reading Mike's work and listening to him on TV occasionally, certainly broadened my horizons in that sense. I don't know. Was it similar for you, Dan?
I'd say that without Mike's advocacy for not just India, but for sort of South Asian cricket, I think it would have taken, certainly personally, I think it would have taken me a lot longer to cotton on to an understanding of it, because you're right. Unless you were reading well outside of the sort of the cricket and sporting sphere, which at our ages and with our interests we probably weren't, you weren't going to get anything like what Mike was saying, the way that he described the countries that he was visiting, whether it was in broadcasting or in the book or in his newspaper work. That attitude, I think, like that kind of, it encouraged me certainly to ask more questions about that part of the world as I was sort of a teenager, into going to university, into starting a journalism career, having an interest in it. And to the fact, or to the point that when I first started getting chances to travel on cricket tours as a journalist, that I jumped at the chance to go to India. I jumped at the chance to volunteer to go to Pakistan in 2008 for a tour that was postponed and never to be played, largely because of what Mike had put out there about what it was like and what it could be like as an experience. And I found that just by having that enthusiasm, it made me an outlier. There was not necessarily this, like, everyone wanted to go to England, everyone wanted to go to South Africa. There was a much shorter queue to go to India, and there were a lot of tours of India to go on. So, I wouldn't be shy in saying that if Mike hadn't sort of provided that advocacy, I probably would have had a much more closed mind to South Asia for a while.
And I think one thing Mike should get credit for in that sense is he didn't necessarily see the economic might of the subcontinent at the time, but I think he saw the numbers, and the cultural significance. And in that sense, he really did predict the future of cricket. If we talk about where we're at now, it's very much an Asian century of cricket that we're in now, and it wasn't at that time. So he had a lot of foresight in seeing, he was going to these countries and he saw the enthusiasm for the game up close, and he could I guess probably contrast that with what he was seeing in Australia and in England too, obviously. But so that for him to have, he really did predict the future to an extent with this work, I think.
Absolutely. I think 2 points come to mind. One is when I was sort of reading that book, and when I was reading several other books back then related to Australia, it struck me how India and Australia, the cricket is like the strongest bond. It's not like England, where you read so much about England from your history books, and from India and England have so much of, the history of colonization, etc. But with countries like with a country like Australia, and then later, of course, other countries too, I started reading about. But cricket was the thing, the window into that world. So as you said, geography or so many other things, you learn about new cities, you learn about new terms, sundries, and all these other kind of the Australian eccentricities that you learn about, and people
the
who don't
score around the wrong way.
yeah, the score the wrong way. And if you don't follow cricket, you don't know. Like I remember this distinctly when in my class there was one boy who was not that interested in cricket, and then something came up about sundries, and he's like, "What the hell is this?" And I'm like, "You don't know what sundries are? You start watching cricket." So that's like the window into that world. And the second thing that comes to my mind is that Mike covered in cricket in India at a time where it was hard being a journalist in India. I mean, the technology was nowhere as close to it as it is now. Now you would go to an air-conditioned press box in almost every Indian venue. You would write your report and you would leave. Or, I mean, of course, you would probably do some things around, and you would try and get a bit of the culture and the city, etc. But the experiences that Mike had were much more rooted, much more closer to the players, because he was sitting in the sun, under the sun in many places. He was not sitting in air-conditioned press boxes. He was not getting, the technology that he needed. He had to often go outside the ground and, request people from various establishments to help him. In fact, there's several anecdotes about how he had this owner of a, factory help him, and this person help him, and that person. So I think what Mike got close to was the player's experience. And that's something that journalists of today might never get close to.
No, that's very right. And there's a great intimacy, particularly to the chapter about the Tide Test. Mike sort of takes us inside Allan Border's hotel room when he gives Dean Jones this 30-minute pep talk saying, and at that stage, Allan Border was under pressure to move up to the number 3 slot himself. And he really didn't want to do that. Everyone knew he didn't want to do it. Mike wasn't one of the ones saying that he should go up, but he takes us inside this hotel room where Allan Border places his faith on the shoulders of a young Dean Jones who's yet to make his first Test century, who's considered quite flighty by a lot of people. And it's funny, but obviously Dean passed away last year, and to a lot of my generation, he was a childhood hero, and you'd try and bat like him in the backyard and adopt his mannerisms and all of these things. So his passing was quite an emotional thing anyway. And I don't normally do this, but when I reread the book in preparation for this conversation, I reread the Tide Test chapter first, and I found it emotionally overwhelming listening to this tale of Dino being primed by AB, getting to the ground and just being ready to run through a brick wall for him, and his growing confidence through that innings. And then, of course, the torture he put himself through physically and mentally in that innings. And a lot of people have speculated in the last year, did that weaken his heart? Did it have a lasting, Dean himself said that it had a lasting physical effect on him. And reading about it, Mike really writing about it almost in the present tense, only a couple of years on from the event, I found it quite an emotional experience. So I'd say to anyone who's seeing this book on eBay, however much it is, if it's $40 or whatever, and you're thinking, is this book worth buying? I think for the chapter on the Tide Test alone, this book, everyone, every cricket lover should have it, because the way he takes you inside those intimate moments in the dressing room and in the hotel room beforehand. It's magic.
There's this book written a couple of years ago, maybe last year, by Michael Sexton about that tight test. It's called Borders Battlers, and it just focuses fully on the tight test. But the difference there between what Michael writes and what Mike Coward writes is that one is told in the past tense. One is like looking back several years after the event and trying to get different points of view. But what you're saying is absolutely right. Mike is writing almost like he's covering it on a daily basis. He is present there. He is one of the he has spoken to, obviously he has spoken to every single person connected to that test match and that episode. And so he takes you in right there. Like you feel that you're in that vehicle that is ferrying Dean Jones from the ground to the hospital with Errol Alcott sitting there, because Mike has spoken to them probably that same evening and got everything from them.
And the bit that I'd forgotten was Ray Bright, how overwrought Ray Bright was by the end of the game. And, I'd always thought of Ray Bright as a very stoic 70s kind of hard-nosed Australian dude. And rereading that yesterday, I was thinking, wow, this really, and that's Mike's skill. You feel like you're standing at the boundary where Ray Bright is having this emotional meltdown and saying, do I go back out or not in the final overs of the game? And that I'm not sure if Mike physically was standing there or whether he got that information secondhand. But the important thing as the reader is that you're right there. You're feeling what Ray Bright is feeling at that point.
Yeah, he's able to, and I think this sort of goes a bit back to what we were saying earlier about non-televised series. One of the things that makes the book so great now, and no doubt made it so great even in 1990 when people, no doubt older than we were reading it for the first time, it paints such vivid pictures of matches that were unseen, and it is able to, like that thing that Russell was talking about us not getting an alternative view of what international cricket was like outside of the Channel 9 lens. Mike wasn't providing an alternative commentary at that point as a broadcaster, but he was certainly providing a really vivid picture that was not of, Nine's creation. And, the descriptions, I think, if you go back to something that I've done quite a bit of recently is having a look at some of his contemporaneous reporting through that period. The flair is still there, but it is tempered somewhat by the deadlines and by the nature of the reporting, daily reporting work that we do. I always got the impression that Mike really enjoyed the chance to go back over these events and do them the justice that he thought that they needed to be done relative to the lack of coverage that they got in Australia and the lack of live broadcast. So, I agree with Rusty about Ray Bright. I think the one of the things that test match did was I think it took numerous Australian players sort of beyond what they thought they were capable of, and certainly beyond even, I guess, their idea of themselves and how they wanted to carry themselves on the field, which was obviously that was always a huge thing in terms of how senior Australian players wanted younger members of teams to carry themselves, because they were always like, don't be like Kim Hughes. Don't wear your heart on your sleeve. We don't want someone with too many tells. But in that crucible, it was almost too hot an atmosphere to not give things away.
And it strikes me how so much of not just Australian cricket but world cricket, so much of our judgment on it is so based on video. I mean, either you watched it on television or if we're lucky enough, we're seeing it on YouTube and able to see, great bowling or great batting. But there is this vast ocean of cricket that is based just not there on video. So, if somebody watched the 1999 World Cup, for instance, and saw Australia winning all those games, getting on that streak, and then winning the World Cup when they were in quite a bit of trouble early on, it's very hard for them to compare that to the 1987 team, because first of all, there's nothing there. The only thing that you can compare is written stuff. The footage is so little, and I would argue that that the Australian victory against South Africa in Headingley, or the victory at Edgbaston, is probably not as pivotal or as great as Australia's win over Pakistan in Lahore in that semi-final. That was like a serious win by a team that was just about starting to get good against like the might of Pakistan in their backyard. But we don't know anything about that game apart from what people like Mike have written. So that's such a tragedy, isn't it?
It is. And I think Mike touches on that on the book. Allan Border's dissatisfaction with the fact that it wasn't being shown in Melbourne and Sydney, the second innings of the final. That
they showed a movie.
They played Unfaithfully Yours, starring Dudley Moore and Natasha Kinski. That and AB was aware of that, and he was sort of angry that he'd taken this scrappy team and won a world, really conjured this World Cup win out of nothing, and there is still to this day not as great a respect for that achievement as there should be, because it wasn't on TV. It just didn't exist to Australians. And, you could say to even a lot of cricket fans in Australia the name Andrew Zesses, and they draw a blank because his career, that was sort of his moment in the sun, was that World Cup. He played a lot of domestic cricket as well. And made a great contribution to cricket in general. But, as an international cricketer, no one really knows of him. And, to an extent, I think there are a number of guys from that 87 squad who probably don't get the kudos they deserve for what they did in that.
Valletta,
yeah, absolutely. In the Thai Test, beyond Dino, Greg Matthews' performance, the 10 wickets he took in that game, again, they sort of don't exist to Australians.
Yeah, and Tim Zora's performance, not necessarily with the bat, but with his mouth.
Yes. I think we sort of knew about that.
Yes. But no, that underappreciated element, and talking about the 87 World Cup semi-final, Australia go to Pakistan in 1980, they get thrashed. They go to Pakistan in 1982, they get thrashed. They go to Pakistan again in 1988, and I wouldn't say they got thrashed in 88, but they certainly got thrashed in the first test. The fact that they put it all together in a World Cup semi-final, and in the same way as England and Graham Gooch were doing in Mumbai in the other semi-final. It's a pretty extraordinary effort and performance. And funnily enough, you talked about the footage. For a long time, the only footage I'd ever seen of the 87 World Cup semi-final was on a BBC video of Imran Khan career highlights, and he bowled a spell of reverse swing late in Australia's innings, where I think he bowled 3 or 4 batsmen in quick succession. And I think I remember just being jarred by seeing these highlights of all these Australians getting knocked over like 9 pins, and then it said Australia won by 17 runs or whatever it was. So I think that put it into context as well as a pretty singular achievement.
Yeah, if you are one of the listeners who has read maybe 850 times that the 1989 Ashes win in England was the start of the glorious Aussie dynasty, maybe you can read this book, and maybe your opinion might change a bit, because this team was being put together, starting with 86, I would think, the Tour of India and the Thai Test, and then they were building. Of course, they had that poor series in Pakistan in 88, and that's bound to happen. But I think that all the cricketers who were part of the great team, Steve Waugh and many others. Dean Jones was there in the beginning, Allan Border, of course, and everyone else were sort of, it had India and Pakistan and the subcontinental tours had a huge role to play in their development.
All right. One of my favourite little anecdotes from the 87 World Cup was around the training that the team did in India prior to the start of the tournament. And I believe they got there probably a week earlier than the rest of the teams. And something that Tom Moody told me once was that he can still remember the sound of the squelching of their sweat-soaked shoes and socks, amid the drills that they were doing. And also the fact that by this point, he was one a bit like Andrew Zezes. That was the first time that he'd been part of an Australian squad that World Cup. But a few of the guys had gotten a bit more used to, by that stage, the fielding standards demanded by Simpson. And I think something that's also very significant about 87 World Cup is that is the first squad that is selected with Simpson as a selector. And so it is the first squad after which I think the key players who were omitted and not sort of to be seen again were your Tim Zura, your Wayne Phillips, David Hooks was another one who didn't play again. Greg Ritchie was another one in particular who didn't play again, and you could probably argue that the record suggests that he probably should have kept playing. But they were all kind of swept away in the aim of getting a more disciplined team together. And then, yes, Simpson gets the team that he wants. He then puts them through the ringer in training. And, had they we'll always ponder what might have happened if they hadn't won that first game again in Chennai by a run.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Chennai was, or Madras as it was then, was extremely crucial for them because the tight test, after the experience of the tight test, they sort of knew what it would take to win in India. And so they chose Madras to go there and prepare because they knew that if they were starting the tournament there, they knew that if they could acclimate to the humidity and the conditions there, then the rest of the World Cup would only get easier than just going there a couple of days before and then really scrambling to get used to the conditions. And there are, so many people in Madras, having seen that so much of that Australian team, I know so many people in Madras who really adore many of those cricketers. Marsh, Boon, Jones. Boon was big in India. Boon was really good in India as well. We haven't mentioned him, but he was, his whole game developed so much while playing in India against spin as well.
Yeah, he totally gets forgotten in, among Dino's innings too, like Greg Matthews does, I suppose. But he was, he was the fastest runner between the wickets, which was a big deal in India. And people probably underrate David Boon in that sense. He's a bit like AB in a way now in the Australian kind of psyche, Australian cricket psyche, that they're remembered in this nostalgic sense. And in Boon's case, it's really for his drinking prowess now that he's remembered rather than the fact that he was a damn good cricketer,
And also that he was, certainly at that stage at the 87 World Cup, he was the dasher.
Yes.
At the top of the order,
yes.
Certainly relative to Jeff Marsh. Not that was difficult, I suppose. But, Boon, it's really interesting you mentioned about sort of the improvement of his game against spin. Early on, he had all sorts of problems against John Embury and Phil Edmonds. He could not make head or tail of them on the 85 Tour of England. And, it's really the 86 Tour, then the 87 World Cup, and then finally I think it's a big 100 he gets in the bicentenary test against certainly against Embury. I can't recall if it was Edmonds as well. That sort of cements in his own mind that he's a player of quality who can not only play pace well, as was natural to him, but also spin. I think Rusty's absolutely right. I think the Boon legacy is a little bit unfair.
Yeah, and the thing about Mike's book is also how he not only talks about the cricket, he also sort of gets deep into understanding how Australia's started coping better in India. And, compared to the 50s and the 60s, where they were all, probably in some cases justified to worry about the health issues and things, because India was a far different country then. But things got better health-wise in the 70s and 80s, and hygiene-wise, but also attitude-wise, where there's a really interesting anecdote where Jeff Marsh, I think it was in 84, there's somebody complaining about rats, and then he just makes a sort of a throwaway comment saying that just like we have back in the farms back home.
On the farm. And it's funny, in that section, Mike he actually names names, which is, I feel like maybe a cricket writer wouldn't do this now, but I quite enjoyed how he said a lot of the tall tales that were passed down through the generations about the difficulties of touring India and these very negative stereotypes that were presented to the next generation of players, that he says, Peter Burge and Jim Burke were the two who passed down those stories of, guys being on death's door and you don't want to go there, it's not a place you want to tour. But yes, there was a tremendous attitude change, I think. But a little bit of it did still linger. I mean, talking at the other end of the sports literature spectrum, there was a series of comedy books called the Warwick Todd Diaries that were around when Dan and I were in our teens. And a large portion of those, as far as the character of this Australian Test cricketer, this comedic character, he was always sort of complaining about the conditions in India and presenting all the stereotypes of the terrible umpiring and all of these things. And of course, it's not until you read work like Mike's that you see, well, not only was the issue of neutral umpiring in particular, if we focused on that, I mean, a lot of the umpiring in Australia was horrendous in that era too, as far as visiting sides not getting LBWs and these sorts of things. So yes, I think it did improve, but it is interesting, as I said, the two forwards, both Imran and Sunil Gavaskar, talking about the refusal of Australian players to adapt to the conditions and how a lot of them still sort of demanded that they were presented with conditions that they were familiar with, and that kind of attitude problem, I think Gavaskar calls it. So that stuff did linger a bit, but I think Mike's probably, he presents that fairly.
Yeah, I think I remember, in 2001, the famous series where VVS Lakshman and Harbhajan Singh helped India win 2-1. That series, the final test was in Chennai, and it was hot. It was March. It was Chennai. It was hot, and apparently this was an anecdote that I read, that some of the Australian players were starting to sort of complain a bit around day 2 or day 3, and then Steve Waugh basically just came and shut them all up and said, none of you guys were around in 1986. I was in that tight test, and this is basically like a pleasant walk in the park compared to that, so stop it. So, and even at the end of that game, he gets asked in the presentation ceremony after losing a series, he gets asked about it, and he says, these are conditions that we played in before, and we've played in before even in Australia. So, and that is something that, Steve Waugh, I think, played a huge role in that as well.
He did. And as early as 1990 in this book, Mike is recognising that he refers to him as Stephen Waugh throughout the book, and he says how, Steve Waugh was at the front of the queue when it came time to make a donation to a local charity when the Australian team was confronted by this, quite a confronting, you're better to read it in the book, but you're seeing the seeds of what we later see with Steve Waugh in his charity work, and all of the good things that he did in India and the way he embraced the culture and got out with a camera and actually explored the country rather than staying in the hotel room, which I think is really Mike's criticism of the earlier teams through the late 70s, early 80s, was the tendency to, when they got to a comfortable 5-star hotel, just sitting by the pool or by the air conditioning, which as elite athletes you can understand. But I think he really, he sees that early, that quality in Steve Waugh, that he's prepared to learn something about the place he's in. And I think that, you later see that in the way Steve Waugh plays as well. That crosses over into his playing persona as well.
Yeah, I love the photo, just looking at it now, of Steve Waugh in '89 with the MRF cap on. It's almost the prototype image for Steve Waugh over the next 20 years in terms of his connection to India and to South Asia. I've no doubt that Mike saw something far-sighted in Steve just through that curiosity. But it's interesting as well that different players or different modes, I suppose, of operating on those tours worked for different guys. Like Border is, it's. I think it was said of him once that he might have played cricket in 20 countries, but he's seen a lot of sets of cricket grounds and hotel rooms. He just doesn't venture, but that was what worked for him. I think the frustration that Mike felt, and certainly some of us have felt even on subsequent tours of India, was that watching occasionally players who did similarly to what Border did, sort of enclose themselves in their hotel cricket ground kind of pattern, but then didn't perform particularly well on the field. It's remarkable how few actually think, well, if this isn't working for me, maybe I do need to explore the country a bit more. That's something which, I guess we'll get to in terms of a difference in attitudes that we saw in Pakistan in 1988 relative to the two tours to India in the preceding 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because for me as well, that was the eye-opening sections of the book when he talks about Pakistan. Mike talks both about the history, where the Australian team's first initial tours to Pakistan, but he also then talks in detail about the tours in the 80s, which he himself covered. And the 88 tour particularly seems to have been a really, really rancorous affair, coming on the, almost abandoned at one point. And the umpiring was such a huge factor for both the teams, especially Australia, as it was for many teams going to Pakistan, which is why Imran Khan even, constantly fought for neutral umpires, which he finally got in '89. But let's talk a bit about that sort of shifting pace towards Pakistan, and what you thought of those bits.
Oh, well, I just said before, if you buy it for the Tide Test chapter. I think equally, before I'd reread it, what I had in mind is that the most fascinating chapter is the 88 Pakistan tour chapter, for all the reasons we've previously mentioned, that it was just this thing that happened on the other side of the world that we didn't really know much about, other than that, the Australian players came back really hardened in their cynicism about the umpiring and about the conditions and about so many other things, that it's an amazing explanation of what can go wrong when people who are meant to be diplomats, as far as the management of the team, when they don't act as diplomats, how quickly things unravel. And yes, the umpiring was certainly a factor in that tour, but I think the entire Australian attitude was a bigger issue than the umpiring. And Mike gets that across. And an interesting aspect of that, again, that probably sets Mike apart, is that he was not alone in his condemnation of the Australians on that tour, but there was certainly a faction within the press pack that certain journalists were fine to go along with the Australian line that they were being duped. Mike really took the other tack and said it's the Australians who've behaved ungraciously on this tour, and that that we got no vision, not much other reporting of that tour. So it was always a little bit of a mystery. So to go back into this book and delve into that tour in such a deep way, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's certainly, and probably this gives away a little bit of, I suppose, the work that I've done subsequently to first reading it. But yeah, it's still my favourite chapter, just because it's so good at not only illustrating the first order kind of blow-ups that are going on relative to umpiring decisions on the field, but the underlying attitudes that are contributing to it, the fact that the Australian press pack is kind of singled out as a potential kind of public relations arm for the disgruntlement of the team management, and also just the fact that the combination of Bob Simpson and Colleague as a coach and manager combination was likely to be a problematic one relative to some of the other combinations that had been to India before and would go subsequently. And that was what I was going to get at before about the fact that Australia travelled so seldom to India and Pakistan after 88, is that, as Mike records in the book, that Colleague goes on to become the next chairman of the ACB not long after that tour. And, that was quite an extraordinary turn of events, not least because he becomes the chairman because it's the continuation of a tradition that New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia get the chairmanship on rotation, whereas enough people on the board were looking to the idea that, well, maybe the chairman should be the best chairman, not the one from the next state in the rotation, and just how far apart those two ideas were. And yeah, I imagine also, and I haven't actually, I've never asked him about this chapter directly, but I imagine that would have been the chapter that would have most likely to have had the phone at the Coward House going off after its publication, because it was interesting as well about that tour in '88 that the issues around the first test and the complaints about the umpires and the indignation of the Australian team were such that Australian 60 Minutes actually sent a crew over later in the tour to try to get to the bottom of why the Australian team was carrying on so much in Pakistan. And I have made a few requests to try to get that 60-minute segment onto YouTube. I haven't been successful yet, but I will keep trying.
Rob Linda surely has it.
It seems not. It seems not at this stage. But as I say, I'll keep trying. But yeah, as I say, again, Mike's very vivid and distinctive voice combined with getting at all the different layers of what was going on and getting at them in a way that I don't think I've ever read of the similar events, obviously, that took place between England and Pakistan the previous season. And, and that's a credit to Mike for how fearlessly he was able to, skewer the coaching and the management, and the fact that there were mentor figures there who stopped acting like they were for a while.
And it suffices to say that chapter is called Conspiracy or Hypocrisy, which gives you some flavour for it.
Yeah, and something else I should add, sorry, Sid, just in regard to that 88 tour, and it's a bit of a reference as well to something Rusty said before about, those sorts of attitudes falling away. They did fall away, but they never fall away forever, and they don't fall away consistently from tour to tour. Sometimes you will see them crop back up. I have a recollection of being in Sri Lanka in 2016 when Australia were, expected to win the series and lost pretty heavily. And the pitches for the first two tests were very, spin-friendly pitches. But the Australian team's mindset was such that and also this attempt, a little bit like a colleague and Bob Simpson attempted in '88, this attempt to kind of co-opt the Australian travelling press as allies in this complaint that the surfaces are no good. We, as a press group, were invited to walk out onto the field and have a look at what the pitch was going to be like for the third test in Colombo. And, the suggestion was that this will be the worst one of the lot. Just look at it. There's no grass on it. And if you actually go and look at that match, it was actually the best pitch of the series. It played really well. And the only reason that Australia lost the game in a hurry was some things to do between the ears rather than anything between the wickets.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally right about how the attitudes perhaps changed in one direction, but then now post 9/11, post the attack on the Sri Lankan team, and post whatever we know, post Afghanistan, of course, most recently, the attitude is, colored by so much else that is happening. I mean, whether it's New Zealand or ECB or I'm sure Australia at some point. So things change, but things also don't change in other regards. The one point, though, that I want to that didn't strike me when I first read the book because I was a bit too young, but has struck me subsequently, is that that particular chapter is such an interesting one from a journalistic point of view, because Mike had all the access that he wanted to that particular team. I mean, I guess he could just take any player or any of the people, aside and just get a quote from them if he wanted, either on or off the record. But at the same time, at the end of it, he's actually critical of so many of the players. So it's very, very interesting to me how you have this journalist who is speaking to everyone, but then he's, at the end of the day, he's writing, he's trying to be as fair as possible to both sides. It's something that won't happen today, right? Neither with the access or with, players just won't talk to you if you start basically being critical of them. I mean, we were on the 2008 series with the famous one with which was called Bally Line, I think, for a while, or whatever. When
Bally Line or Monkeygate.
Monkeygate, yeah, when they got into trouble. But that was such a world apart from what Mike was doing in '88.
Well, I was going to say Mike worked alongside, in his later years, Ray Robinson. And Ray Robinson used to go into the Australian dressing rooms and they would take the top off a beer hours before the end of play and stick it in one of their lockers, because Ray Robinson, he was quite ill by that point and he could only drink flat beer, and the players held him in such high regard that they would take the top off the beer so it went flat for him. And you fast forward, 45, 50 years now, and I don't think that's happening in the Australian sheds now. But, Mike, I think there was certainly a greater mutual trust between journalists and the people they were writing about. And in that era too, they were closer in their pay brackets back then than they are now, much closer. Oh, yes. So the whole dynamic was a little different. And, we'd be going into another podcast episode to talk about this, but there's a book that comes out subsequent to this a year later about Australia's 1991 tour of the West Indies.
Calypso.
It's called Calypso Cricket. And we probably couldn't put to air an episode about that book, but it suffices to say that several journalists of that era refer to it as the book that changed everything. And Mike was probably a beneficiary of the pre-Calypso cricket times where you could have a candid conversation with someone in confidence. and try and reach a level of understanding of the issues at play rather than, using an inflammatory quote or going with a rumour. But there's blame on both sides for that, certainly.
I think there's also, the jury is still out whether Calypso cricket is a work of fiction or non-fiction. So we're still not sure about that.
Well, it's certainly, it was probably worth noting that by the time that Cricket Beyond the Bazaar came out, Mike had been a touring cricket journalist for 17, 18 years. Like his first tour was the 72 Tour of England. So he was
even at the Munich Olympics in 72, as he mentions in the book.
That's right. So he is, by that point, he is much more seasoned in Australian cricket than even Allan Border is. So, that level of seniority and respect at a time when, yes, there were certain things that, touring journalists, touring reporters were not going to go into, and they had it as almost as a point of pride that they were going to leave it to things going on the field and directly connected to those events. But it was also, it was a period where there were far fewer interlocutors between the players and the journalists themselves, and that ringing, just directly ringing hotel rooms for a quote, like that sort of thing was commonplace, as was not really having to kind of do anything more than gesture over to the captain or the coach towards the end of a training session to set up interviews. So, that much more casual sort of environment lent itself to a lot of the reporting and the work that's in Cricket Beyond the Bazaar. And absolutely, yes, the 1991 Tour of the West Indies and Calypso cricket, that definitely has an impact on that level of familiarity and that level of trust. And I think something that I could say as a sort of a link to that, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago, that when Gideon Haigh was trying to write The Cricket War, he was trying to write it at a time when it was really difficult for an outsider or perceived outsider who wasn't a cricket beat reporter to come in and try to ask a lot of awkward questions of players and administrators, because they were all still reeling from the release of Calypso cricket. So I have a feeling that maybe a few of the people who didn't cooperate with him for the cricket war, or who maybe didn't give him as much as he wanted, as much, even though it's still, it's one of the three, really sort of formative books, certainly in my life in covering cricket. But I reckon it could have been an even greater book if he'd written it in 1990 rather than in 1992, 93.
And if you want to get a visual on that, what Dan said about, Mike having been around for so long, certainly by the time the 88 tour rolled around, there's a book of Mike's called The Chapel Years, and there's a photo of him on the tarmac at Melbourne, I think, or maybe it's Sydney, about to depart for the 1972 Ashes, and he's standing with the rest of the Australian press corps. And that group includes Richie Benaud and Jack Fingleton. He also was in that generation of journalists where a lot of them were former players. And, obviously Jack Fingleton, you've got knowledge there stretching back to the sort of 1920s and 30s. So, it was just a different scene. The media scene back then was vastly different from what it is now.
Yeah, and you're right about how there was a comradeship between the players and the press, largely because of the pay grade being not too different. And also, Mike writes about how they couldn't, after the semi-final in Lahore in the 1987 World Cup, they couldn't get to India back on time for various logistical reasons, and they could get to the final in Calcutta only like on the wee hours of the morning of that final. So basically you had like 3 days or something where you had to file stories, and then they had Allan Border and Bob Simpson, who were already in Calcutta, feeding them information about the ground and the pitch and things like that. And then they using that information to write their stories from Pakistan. I mean, who can even imagine anything like that happening today?
Well, it's funny. It's actually to some, I wouldn't say they've gone full circle, but we are now in a period with COVID where when cricket journalists start touring again more consistently, I think some of the difficulties that we're going to experience will they won't be exact parallels with what was happening in the 1980s, but there will be a greater degree of hassle, for lack of a better term, that I think, it's going to require a level of forbearance that maybe we were allowed to take for granted during that, let's say that loose period from around 2000 to 2020. And yeah, the patience that is required, but also the trust that is required. I mean, not that it was a major tour, but the Australian team's tour of West Indies and Bangladesh in the middle of this year, where ostensibly you're meant to be writing about the tour, but you're not there. You all you can really go on are the existing relationships that you have with people who are on the trip, in addition to whatever the team media manager and the players doing Zoom calls will give you, and it's a much smaller world if you're not on the ground and you don't have the evidence of what you can see in addition to what you're being told.
Yeah, and it's also one of the things that strikes anyone who's reading that book will be how the politics was so vastly different back then, and how India was nowhere close to the India that in the cricketing sense that it is today. Australia was weak in the cricketing front in the 80s, but they were still extremely strong in the administrative and sort of the cricket politics. And now, of course, you have the big three where Australia actually get to go on longer tours to India. They actually play, more than 3 tests. And last time they were there, they played 4 tests. And it's very likely that they will end up playing a 5-test series pretty soon. At some point. And they obviously go back for the IPL, etc. But yeah, like the Australian teams then, they went back quite often, but they never got to have that kind of scale of a series that the teams now have. And of course, they didn't have IPL and things back then, so they wouldn't have been able to interact that much with the Indian players otherwise.
And that's something we probably underrate as far as the obstacles for the Australian teams of the 1970s and 80s is, one success, I suppose, through 86, 87 was that a few players had come through from youth tours of India. Tom Moody and Zesses were 2, who'd come through the youth system and been to India and had that experience. When you talk about Ashes tours, a lot of guys, by the time they made the test squad and made an Ashes tour, they'd done a season or 2 in the leagues in England. But back then there was no IPL. There weren't as many youth tours. A youth tour to India was maybe every 3 or 4 years, if that. So they just didn't have the grounding in those conditions. They didn't have the experience. And right down to the culture of spin bowling in Australia, the 80s was really a wasteland for Australian spin bowling. So, we can talk about all of these other things about attitude, but equally, the Australian teams weren't always the best prepared for the conditions just for those reasons.
On behalf of Bob Holland and Peter Sleep, I'm deeply offended.
Bruce Yardley. Yeah, sorry.
One of the other formative memories I have of sort of being conscious of Indian cricket as a significant thing was, I don't know, you guys, you guys would probably remember this, but there was a centenary triangular series, or it might have been a quadrangular series involving India, Australia, South Africa and New Zealand in early 1995. And Australia win the series quite easily, but their only loss is against India in Dunedin, I think. And it's the first time I could ever consciously remember, like we didn't see the game live, but we saw the news reports, seeing footage of Shane Warne getting slogged and getting hit for six. You know, I think, you know, apart from maybe one or two innings by Hansi Cronje the year before, it was just not something we conceived of at that point, after he'd sort of laid waste to England, South Africa, New Zealand, England again.
Ravi Shastri had given him a bit of a touch-up in his debut test, Dan.
Yeah, but after he ditched the mullet and a few kilos and started bowling, you know, a flipper every other over. It was amazing to think that there were players on the other side of the world that we hadn't actually seen in Australia who were giving Warne a bit of tap.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point, because as I said, India got to play a lot against the Australians of the 80s, but they didn't get to play as much of the Australia of the early 90s. I mean, personally, I think I would have loved for India to play Shane Warne between 1994 and when he had that injury, probably 96 or 97 even. They didn't play them at all. And Warne didn't come for that one-off test. I think that was when he was injured. Warne bowled a fantastic spell in that one World Cup match in Mumbai against India in 1996. Often forgotten. People remember that first ball hit going after him the very first ball. But over the 10-over spell, Shane Warne was magnificent, as he was through that World Cup, and helped Australia reach the final. But yeah, it's quite a shame that Shane Warne didn't play against India when in that period after his coming out party in England and between when he got injured for the first time.
I think if Mike had got his wish from what he was trying to convey in Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, Shane Warne's probably played 20 test matches against India by the year 2000. It's something that I've discussed with Mike before about, the visionary kind of nature of the book. He's proud of the fact that it was, but he will always remind you that it only took them 10 years to catch up.
Also, one of the characters who is, I think, a hero of the book, and of course, Mike has written about him in subsequent years, and he's done a lot of great research on him, is Frank Tarrant. I had no idea about him before I read this book. For me, it was always like the Australian coaching involvement in India always began with Dennis Lillee at the MRF Pace Foundation. But here was Frank Tarrant, who, in the 20s and 30s was laying the foundation for not just Australia and India's relations in the cricketing sense, but also coaching young Indian cricketers and encouraging them to, teaching them ways to play the game and getting star cricketers, from Australia to India, like in the 1935-36 tour when Jack Ryder's team came along and played this set of matches. Yeah, so what do you guys make of that? And did you know anything about Frank Tarrant before that?
Not a lot. And I'm a little out of the loop on this, but I know the last time I spoke to Mike, maybe 2 years ago, he was actually writing a book about Frank Tarrant. I'm not sure if that's out yet or not.
Yes, I've got it. Yes.
Oh, it is.
It is, yes.
Well, we can plug a second Mike Cowell
book. Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's not a big book, but it's certainly it's a very good addition to what's in Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, and it's actually something that and I'd particularly be interested in your thoughts on this, Sid. But there is Mike is very keen for the idea that there's there is a recognition of Tarrant in whether it is in the awarding of a trophy for the best player in a series between Australia and India, or some kind of recognition of the work that he did to bring cricket and Australia and India together through cricket. But something that seems to me to be maybe a little bit of a roadblock to that is that every series we play these days seems to it needs to have a joint trophy. It needs to have a joint trophy involving contemporary players from both sides, and it's almost like the kind of this sort of nationalistic itch of the two competing nations needs to be scratched. So someone like Tarrant, who was almost an old, if not British Empire, then certainly Commonwealth kind of figure, doesn't really fit the profile.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think for a trophy, it's now become commonplace to have like cricketers' names on there. I mean, the Frank Worrell Trophy is I think an exception where you have just one cricketer's name. Otherwise, a lot of it is portmanteau. And I like the fact that Border is in there. As we discussed, Allan Border and India share a deep and long relationship. So I'm glad he's there. Gavaskar had played a lot against Australia. So I'm glad. I have no problems with him being there. Though if they were to change it to Tendulkar at some point, I wouldn't have a problem either. But I just think that there should be some kind of recognition. I'm pretty sure that very, very few Indians know about Frank Tarrant, and even people in the cricketing sphere don't know much about him. So yeah, we definitely have to, there'd be a good way to memorialize what he did for Indian cricket. But anyway, I think I've taken up a lot of your time. Just final thoughts about the book today. How it stacks up. Given the time that has passed. And I always feel that it's a great, great book for Australians, for all Australians to read, not just cricket buffs. I think it gives you a deep understanding of this Indian subcontinent. There's a lot of great travel material in there as well. And I also think that it opens you up into a new kind of, world, something that you might not have seen before. And what do you think? How do you think it's still relevant today? Very much
In summary, I'd say yes, it's still very relevant, and it would fill a lot of gaps in the knowledge of a lot of even quite informed cricket fans, I think. So I thank Mike for writing it, and I also thank a guy named Wes who clearly gave his copy away, because the copy I've got, it cost me $2 at a secondhand shop. And it's inscribed, Wes, good luck and good reading. Best wishes, Mike Coward. So I would like to thank Wes for giving up his copy, which is now mine.
I wonder if it's Wes Hall.
I can similarly say that my book has an inscription, but blessedly, it was actually one from Mike to me after, I believe I think I'm right in saying what happened was that after the Tea Tree Gully Library copy that I'd first borrowed, I wanted a copy of my own. I had one that I bought in a secondhand store that was very, very battered and I think quite water damaged. And I think what happened was that not long after I sort of first came in contact with Mike through cricket journalism, I think I said to him at one point, look, I love Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, but some of the pages are stuck together and I can't actually read them. And so he very, very kindly sent me a personally signed copy with what he says, best wishes for a long and fruitful writing career. But yeah, it's I said about sort of formative cricket books. The three that I was thinking about the other day that sort of that stick out to me. One is The Cricket War, one is Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, and one is Border and Beyond by Mark Ray, which was sort of a journalistic account of Australian cricket, sort of circa 1985 to 1995. So and of those three books, The Cricket War is unbelievably well reported. The Border and Beyond is a fearless book in a lot of ways because it gives you a version of Australian cricket history that wasn't the Channel 9 version, as we were referring to before. But Cricket Beyond the Bazaar is absolutely the most vivid book, and certainly when I visited India for the first time in 2008, which was it was really nice to do it on a tour where Mike was there and broadcasting and writing. The first city that I went to was Jaipur for a tour game, and the descriptions in Cricket Beyond the Bazaar really did match up to the reality, and I don't think there's a better compliment to pay it.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't agree enough. I mean, earlier in the year, we had done a podcast about another great book, Mike Marcus here's War Minus the Shooting, which was about the 1996 World Cup. And, I would say Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, War Minus the Shooting, they give you an insight into the subcontinent that you would not get in the mainstream newspapers or general reading, or definitely not in television news, I mean. It sort of opens you up into a kind of an original way of looking at things that are very interesting. Thanks a lot, Rusty and Dan. This has been a great conversation, and I will surely be calling you both back for one reason or the other. Perhaps we could talk about one of Dan's books. Perhaps we can talk about Rusty's book that we will hopefully get to read at some point, or any other classic work of cricket.
Just get the lawyers sit, and we can do Calypso cricket.
Calypso cricket will be fantastic. Absolutely.
Or we could just get a I think Rusty's. I reckon Rusty's first book should probably just be an anthology of the magnificent work he's been doing for the ABC of late.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I will be linking several of their articles. A homepage with their articles, also particular articles that I think you should sample. And great. I hope everything goes well, and thanks so much for joining again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for listening. You can follow us at 81 All Out on Twitter. You can go to our website at 81allout.com. You can support us. This is a crowdfunded platform, so please support us on Ko-fi. That's ko-fi.com/81allout. You can put in a monthly subscription fee, or you can put in a one-time contribution. Everything helps. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back with another podcast sometime soon.
He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wide.